Good morning, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway from the Garrison Church of God and from the Riverdale Community Church. I'm glad you've chosen to join me this morning for this service. I want to share with you a little bit about faithfulness gives a blessing. We'll be looking a little bit at Psalm 89, verses 34 through 36, but the wider context is verses 24 through 37. And I know that this passage is intriguing to me because it talks about the faithfulness of God in our lives. For Ethan, the world had kind of gone sideways in his life. We know very little about him, but from this psalm, we know that he had a lot of respect for David, and from the implications in the psalm, it seems to take place sometime during those last 2 years of David's life. David was failing in health, and his memory was having problems, and so there were a lot of things going on in David's life at this particular juncture. Because of that, a lot of the people that David had surrounded himself with were people from his own family or close associates that had been there most of his life. David had tried to eliminate some of the conflict that was happening by appointing his son Solomon as co-regent. But that was not working out well. There were some problems with it. Solomon's older brother, Adonijah, who had had many years of experience as a leader in Israel, was trying to maneuver to get the throne. Also, David's family had been placed in positions within the bureaucracy. One of the most powerful people in Israel at the time was his cousin Joab. Joab had been the commander and was still at this time the commander of the armies of Israel. He was a powerful leader, well respected, though not well trusted by the people of Israel. Joab was a man that David had depended upon and had been capable in his leadership. But as he had grown older, of course, he, like David, his abilities had faded with his physical strength. But he still was sort of a power broker in Israel. Another man that had been with David from the very beginning of his rise to power, even back when David was in exile, was one of the high priests. There were actually two of them at this time, but one of the high priests was Abiathar or Abiathar. Abiathar had been there for David at very critical times. But both of these men, with the rise of Solomon, saw their position fading. And so they threw in their lot with Adonijah, David's older son. They determined that they had a better future with him. This caused a great deal of conflict and a great deal of concern within the people of Israel. Solomon was still a young man, somewhere between the age of 18 to 22. He was untried and untested. He had never been on the battlefield, had never really held positions within the government. Many of the people in the bureaucracy didn't really trust him. Many of the nobility of Israel didn't trust him. How was he going to lead? The man Ethan in this psalm expresses his concern as he watches David's failing health, his concerns for the future, his concerns for everything else, and he had to come to a conclusion as these people were jockeying for position around him. We often face those kinds of questions in our own world when things become a little frayed at the edges or a little unglued, a little difficult at times. Undoubtedly, the man Ethan questioned whether there was a future for him or a future for his nation. He looks at David and ultimately comes to the conclusion that he is going to have to trust God's faithfulness, not only for himself, but also for his hero, David. I have to trust that, God, you are faithful in the midst of these confusing times. In 1923, at the age of 57, a man who had had a varied career, who lived through one of the most transformative periods of American history at the close of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, wrote a poem, and he sent it along to another friend who was almost exactly the same age and had lived through many of the same things. That man's name was William Runyon. The man who wrote the poem was Thomas O. Chisholm. He had been a school teacher, a newspaper editor, a handyman, business manager and editor of a Christian magazine, a minister, and now he was an insurance salesman because his physical health would not allow him to pursue a more hectic lifestyle that he had had while a minister. He traveled a lot as an insurance salesman. He lived in New Jersey. In fact, he lived in Vineland, New Jersey. He would die, surprisingly, in 1960 at the age of 94, even though his health had been a difficult process for him through most of his life. He had, at his own admission, accrued very little in the way of wealth or even prestige. He wrote over 1,200 songs during his life. The one he wrote in 1923 became one of the best-loved hymns in America and in England. He found consolation in the scripture in Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 through 24. It says there, "It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore I will hope in him." Verse 23 was a special comfort to Thomas on the road selling insurance, struggling with health issues. And because of that, he wrote the poem, "Great is thy faithfulness." When his friend William received the sheaf of poems that Thomas had written, as he leafed through them, his attention was drawn to this particular poem. He recalled praying that God would give him a tune that would reflect the character of this poem. William worked for Moody Institute and a small hymnal publisher. When the hymn was published in 1923, it made little impact. In fact, few people sung it or heard of it or read it even, until a professor at Moody found it and began using it in chapel worship. It became so popular at Moody that it became sort of a theme song for the entire Moody Bible College. In the 1950s, Billy Graham would introduce this song through his crusades to the wider American audience and to the English audience during his crusades in England. Soon it would become one of the most beloved hymns of all times. In 1941, Thomas had recalled, while reflecting on this hymn, these words: "My income has not been large at any time due to impaired health in the earlier years, which has followed me until now. Although I must not fail to record here the unfailing faithfulness of a covenant-keeping God, and that He has given me many wonderful displays of His providing care, for which I am filled with astonishing gratefulness." What a wonderful attitude to have. I think Ethan would have tracked with Thomas. Thomas's life had been relatively ordinary, one with little notoriety. Ethan is only mentioned one other time in the Bible, and we're only told that he was one of the wisest men in Israel. This psalm is all that is really recorded of his writings or his thought. He and Thomas faced their world with a confidence that God was ultimately faithful. Thomas's hymn, "Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me." He goes on to talk about the summer and the winter and the springtime and the harvest. He talks about nature and its celebration of God. And then he talks about the pardon for sin and the peace that endures in his life. He talks about God's presence and his strength for the day. And then he talks about the blessings that he has. God's faithfulness is our blessing in life. In Psalm 89, verse 24, Ethan says of King David that God's faithfulness will be with him. It is a statement of confidence, not in David, but confidence in God's character. Ultimately, that's what optimism is. It is a confidence that God will bring good no matter what. I hope you have that confidence today. God's blessings on you. Have a wonderful day. Hope to see you in church.